Good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Allison. I have been following Dr. Allison's work for a few years now, and it's been very inspiring, and I'm very excited to come here from Seattle. He's working as a professor at the University of Washington in the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs. Dr. Allison has nearly 30 years of experience working in the field of fisheries assessment, management, and policy around the world, among other places in sub-Saharan Africa, in Oceania, Asia, and Latin America. He has worked with various different international organizations such as the FAO, the World Bank. He has been in director position at the World Fish Center in Malaysia for many years, and has been a professor at the University of East Anglia in the UK. Dr. Allison's work mainly focuses on the contribution of fisheries and aquaculture to food and nutrition security and to coastal livelihoods, the governance of small-scale fisheries and aquaculture production, as well as people's vulnerability and adaptation to climate change. His talk today focuses on governing fisheries for food security. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Allison.
Thank you, Anna. Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here. Coming from the University of Washington on Friday the 13th, I'm not sure whether that's a good idea or asking for trouble. I'm not going to be particularly controversial, I think. What I want to talk about is some ongoing things that I think about. I always think that giving a talk about work that you've already finished, presenting it as a fait accompli, there's only really two outcomes. You can either be praised or criticized, but nobody can change your mind. So by giving work that's in progress, I hope that there will be discussion that hopefully will influence and shape my thinking as well. And give you things to think about that are of contemporary relevance. I want to talk really about three things. First of all, just to get us all on the same page, thinking about how fisheries and aquaculture contribute to nutrition and food security. The area that I'm probably going to say least about, because I think it's the area that the group here has the leading global reputation on, is analysing the things that threatens that contribution. I might say something about some of the initiatives that are taking place to try to do something about the threats to that contribution. And I want to end really by asking for views and presenting a few rough ideas on what might fisheries that are governed for food security and nutrition look like. So the reason we're interested in this obviously is obvious. We have this food security challenge of feeding a growing population and concern for the ability of overexploited fisheries to do that. We should start briefly with definitions. Food security is a dynamic concept. It's inclusive, all people, at all times, have access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active life. So there's a lot in that definition. It's not simply about getting enough calories. Within food security and within that area of nutritious food, nutrition security is this concept that, particularly in the case of fisheries, is perhaps as important as the broader food security definition. And that's really the adequate consumption of micronutrient-rich foods. And the UN definition includes fish in that and highlights their crucial role in preventing disease, ensuring appropriate child development, and preventing future diet-related diseases. So fisheries are important in the nutrition world and increasingly recognized as such. And there's been an explosion of literature linking fisheries and nutrition and food security recently. Some of the ways that it's linked. The obvious one, and the one that we tend to think about, is through consumption. So there's a global fisheries and aquaculture production that is then available for consumption by the human population. And about half the population's, more than half the population of the planet gets more than a sixth of their animal source protein from fish. We've quantified it in terms of protein. We haven't quantified the contributions in terms of micronutrients. And that's actually potentially the area that's more important. But we also have indirect contributions to food security by the people that can access food through the market, through their purchasing power, by the contributions that fisheries make, both directly to household incomes. And if you plot up the number of people who work in fishery-related occupations and their dependents, you get figures of around about 500 million people. And it's also a sector that provides economic contributions. It provides contributions to growth. And the theory there is that growth, revenue contributions at a sort of macroeconomic level sort of filter through the economy, increase people's access to things like healthcare and education, which help in turn to secure their access to employment, food security, through those very indirect pathways. And a lot of the current strategies of organizations like the World Bank are very much focused on this kind of macroeconomic pathway of saying, if we generate more rent, more revenue from fisheries, then we will help food security through these sort of trickle-out, trickle-down type processes. Okay, you're all familiar with these kinds of stats and the problems with them. But according to FAO statistics, if you look at the growth of fish production, a first look when you present this to kind of, people who are not familiar with the world of fisheries is, well, what's the problem? The total fish production is increasing faster than population growth. So there's a per capita increase in potential supply globally over the last 60 years. So, and a lot of that is due to growth in aquaculture, of course. And if you look at that more closely, aquaculture has been among the fastest food production, the fastest growing food production system in the world over the last 30, 40 years. And we do have a problem in that capture fisheries production, we know, is stagnating and has showed negative growth in the last decade. Aquaculture production has slowed from a peak in the late 1980s. Still growing, but not as fast as it did. That growth is slowing down. But overall, we're producing more. So many people equate production with food security. If you can produce enough for people, remember the global per capita supply is increasing, then you've solved the biggest problem in the food security arena. Well, there's all kinds of reasons why that's not the case. Just one simple one. A lot of that increased fish production is not about getting more fish to hungry, nutrient-deficient people. It's about getting fish to people who perhaps have enough to eat already. So a lot of that increase is just supplying increased demand in places where people have a choice over what to eat, and food security and micronutrient deficiencies are not necessarily a source of major concern. So where do people eat fish? The places where people are most dependent on fish, the maritime nations of Southeast and East Asia, and perhaps more surprising to some people, the band of countries across West and Central and East Africa, including several countries which get most of their fish from freshwater production. And when you look at the dependence of fish in those lower income countries, the ones where people are food insecure, if you take countries with per capita GDP of less than $2,000 a year, and with a proportion of fish of animal protein consumption of more than 20%, and you look at these countries, they're largely still dependent on capture fisheries, the dots in blue there. The redder the color, the more aquaculture contributes to that fish production. So really, we're in a situation where the poorest countries, the ones that and the ones that consume a significant proportion of fish, are still very much dependent on capture fisheries. So sustaining capture fisheries is an imperative. So many of the people that say, well, aquaculture is providing the solution to fish gaps, it's not reaching yet the places where fish is most needed. We also tend to talk, when we think of fisheries, mostly about mostly about marine fisheries. But inland fisheries, although they only make up 10% of global production, are incredibly important as direct sources in local markets in many countries. And there's a general pattern that the lower income countries have a higher dependence on inland fish production. Some work we put together for a recent FAO conference on inland fisheries a couple of weeks ago. And essentially what it shows is that the relationship that you see is one between total animal protein consumption per capita and per capita GDP. So it's the well-known relationship that the richer you are, the more protein you consume. But the dots, the size of the dots, relates to the proportion of that protein that comes, the animal protein, that comes from freshwater fish. And if you look at the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the yellow ones, and South and Southeast Asia, the sort of orange and red ones, they're the countries which have the highest proportion of freshwater fish. And in many cases, it's up to 50% of animal protein comes from freshwater fish. And if you take total fish, then it's higher than that still. But the critical point here is that freshwater fisheries, which are less assessed, more neglected, more poorly managed, more threatened perhaps even than marine fish, are not really part of our thinking when it comes to sustaining fisheries for food security. And yet they're very, very critical in some of these lower income countries. And the purpose of this conference last week was really to try to bring more attention to them. We've also got, of course, a whole bunch of things that never appear in any fishery statistics. I was working recently, not so recently now, in the Niger Delta. And there's this enormous harvest of mangrove periwinkles. I actually found one of Daniel Pauly's early papers, a lagoon in Ghana, that had one of the few estimates of sort of production and biomass of this species. There's been surprisingly little work on it since. But in this community here, it was supporting the livelihoods of thousands of women who went daily into the mangroves to gather these mangrove periwinkles. And there was a belief that these were particularly good food for pregnant women. And they're used very widely to flavor soups and stews in this part of West Africa. So all of this is missing. And in a way, this is one of your IUU fishing, and I think that's one of the reasons why these categories are somewhat problematic. It's unreported and it's unregulated. It's not illegal because there isn't any laws about it. But lumping those things in together is problematic. And I think some of the unregulated and unreported fisheries are some of the ones that are the small, nutrient-dense fish and shellfish that go directly to some of the poorest and most marginalized people. So understanding and incorporating those into our thinking about fisheries management is really important from a nutrition and food security point of view. We tend to think, and there's lots and lots of data about the importance of fish, omega-3s and heart disease in developed countries, and we tend to think of that as heart disease, diabetes, obesity as sort of first world problems. But these are now becoming global problems with some of the highest rates of obesity in developing countries and rates of diabetes, coronary heart disease. Omega-3s are a proven source of risk reduction when it comes to heart health. And you're now starting to see consumption advisories for different types of fish and different levels of omega-3 in developing countries. And this particular poster is, I think, from Malaysia, which identifies the kinds of fish which are high in omega-3s and those which are less so. So these kinds of things will drive consumption patterns as health advisories have a role in shifting demand to different types of species as people become conscious of the health costs and benefits of eating different types of food. A lot of the work that's done on fish and nutrition has been on some of these smaller fish that we don't see very much in markets. In fact, there's a disproportionate amount of work done on the fish that we eat, and so we know what's healthy and not in our diets. There's actually a lack of work on these kinds of small fish, which are important to the people who need them most. The sort of exception to this is the work that former colleague of mine, Shakuntala Thilsted, and her PhD student, Nana Roos, did on the small fish these are freshwater fish, in Bangladesh and Cambodia, and the contribution that these made to people's diets. And this was a story of really small fish providing multiple rich sources of essential micronutrients. And just a couple of examples. Iron deficiency affects millions of expectant mothers and young children around the world. And it turns out that some of these fish, all the long Latin names there, are particularly rich in iron, comparable or better than other sources which may be less bioavailable. And the story is similar with vitamin A. Now, vitamin A deficiency kills 40 million children a year worldwide. It's mostly being addressed through vitamin A staple crop enrichment programs. You've probably seen orange flesh, sweet potatoes, and herd of golden rice, for example. But just conserving people's traditional source of these vitamins would be one way to reconcile food security with conserving the ecosystems and the resources that live in them. And here again, these fish, particularly mola there, has a very high content of retinol active vitamin A. But it matters which bit of the fish you eat. If you look at where that retinol is concentrated, well, half of it is in the eye. So if you're the type of person that fastidiously picks the eye out of your fish before eating it, you're losing half your vitamin A. And the viscera, particularly the liver, it wasn't looked at separately, but the liver is where most of the rest of it is. So as we see a shift in Bangladesh and elsewhere from people eating small indigenous fish species like this towards eating cheap fillets of farmed pangasius and tilapia, we see a loss of nutritional quantity. So although people may be maintaining or even increasing the quantity of fish that they eat, they might actually be decreasing the quantity of nutrition that they gain from that fish. And this is, in a way, the wider story about food and food security. We've got access to more and more calories, but the quality of our food and the quality of people's access to food, particularly poorer people's access to food, is actually decreasing in many cases. And this is something that we haven't really taken on board and understood and dealt with in fisheries yet. There are attempts to sort of pilot ways of dealing with this, and here's an example from Bangladesh about using aquaculture to address vitamin A deficiency. And basically the strategy is to address this problem with the small indigenous fish that are meeting up to 40% of daily requirements of vitamin A in Bangladeshi rural households. And you can farm these in ponds alongside carp. So carp is your cash crop, the one that you take to urban markets. And you can also maintain populations of these small indigenous fish, which are self-feeding in your farms, and use that as your fish for home consumption. And this then fulfills the dual function of fisheries and aquaculture as something for your own nutrition and something for the market that allows you to purchase other goods which may support your broader food security, such as access to healthcare. When we talk about fish and food, it's important to remember that food is about more than nutrition. It's cultural as well. Most of us associate some foods with particular celebrations, Thanksgiving and turkeys, fish and Easter, if you're, or Lent, if you're a Catholic, I once worked in a fishery in Bolivia where people didn't eat much fish, and yet the week before Easter, there was a concentrated fishery, and this thing called Prochilodus, which runs up the Rio Pilcomayo, has the misfortune to time its spawning runs roughly for Easter. And so there's this enormous concentrated exploitation around this time, and truckloads of it go to La Paz. And that's about the only time when people in La Paz eat a great deal of fish. But understanding those kinds of linkages and preserving those kinds of values also feeds into the discussion about, what are the options and values for managing fisheries. So if we examine the question then of, well, what is management? What is fishery management? Management, the purpose of human action to accomplish a goal, or it's also being defined as the transformation of resources, in this case fish, into utility. So that being the case, then what are the goals of fishery management? What is the utility that we're transforming fish into? Well, we manage fisheries for a whole range of purposes. You could paddle your policy canoe in any of these directions. Conserving biodiversity, maximizing revenues, maximizing the supply of cheap fish, maximizing employment, or just not bothering about fisheries management and not spending any money on it. So those of you who are fishery biologists, which is a lot of you here, I guess, will recognize, of course, that is in some way a Gordon-Schaefer curve. If you don't like the unofficial version, there's a more official version. And essentially we have these different target reference points that we manage for. None of them are specifically about food or nutrition. And yet most of the fishing that we do is ultimately for food. If we look at what we're currently managing fisheries for, legally, the legal mandate in the law of the sea and so on is largely defined by maximum sustainable yield. States have a sort of a duty to ensure that the fishery resources within their exclusive economic zones are maximized within, are managed within maximum sustainable yield. Now the dominant sort of policy discourses around at the moment are really around trying to make fisheries more efficient, trying to ensure that we get less fishing to generate more revenue by increasing the value of each fish landed, and recovering the sunken billions, the title of a well-known report published by World Bank and FAO and others a few years back. And the other, of course, dominant policy discourse is limiting the loss of biodiversity that indiscriminate and over-harvesting is causing. And there are alternative policy discourses out there as well. People, different interest groups, people who are trying to argue that fisheries is also about securing livelihoods, securing the future of communities and ensuring their sort of cultural survival. Many indigenous groups argue from this perspective. And there are people who are concerned about the equitable distribution of the benefits, which is a different problem from trying to maximize the aggregate benefits. Economists often treat these two things as rather separate, create value first and then worry about how to distribute it afterwards. I would submit that in fisheries you kind of have to worry about these things simultaneously rather than sequentially. It's not all doom and gloom. We are succeeding in fisheries governance reform in various places. This is just a rapid synthesis, very summarized, of where we're succeeding with different types of instruments. The only point that I want to make from this really is that there are various things that work in terms of objectives of resource sustainability. How good they are at distributing benefits and how good they are at ensuring nutrition security is something that's a bit more of an open question. I noticed that there's a slide out of sequence, so I'll skip back to that one. MPAs, of course, are one of the popular governance instruments and have seen some success around the world in conserving fisheries and arguably in providing increased benefits to fisheries in surrounding areas. And there is a sort of discourse around MPAs that says, well, if you protect marine areas, it's going to result in food security. And when you look at the analysis that supports that, it sort of looks a bit like that. So we pointed this out to the people who are managing the Coral Triangle Initiative, which is USAID, WWF, Conservation International, and TNC, in a paper, and you probably can't read the detail of this, but it doesn't matter so much. Essentially what we've tried to do is we looked at what the strategy of that project was, and its aims and objectives were couched in terms of food security. The purpose of the Coral Triangle Initiative is to conserve, is to contribute to food security, to allow marine resources to contribute to food security. And the strategy for doing that is a series of marine protected areas and conserved seascapes. And when you dig into the detail of the reports, you begin to see that all the outcomes and all the measures for success in that project and all the activities are geared towards the creation of seascapes, marine protected areas. And there is a black box that then connects it to those food security outcomes. So we wrote a paper that sort of pointed out some of the things that you might need to put in that black box. And nobody, I don't think they thanked us particularly, but I think some of it was sort of taken on board. And looking at the policy environment, the distributional impacts, and questioning and trying to sort of get people to articulate their logic. How do you get from a conserved area to somebody living in a coastal city in Indonesia having a better health outcome, fewer stunted children? What is the series of things that has to happen? And does your responsibility stop with the creation of a marine protected area? Have you actually made a difference by creating that marine protected area? And if you haven't and you can't articulate that logic, then why sell marine protected areas in that context? Okay, so if you're going to, you have to say how it's going to happen. And I think to their credit, the agencies have responded and started to sort of articulate these pathways and to invest in how they might look to ensure that the creation of marine protected areas does lead to, for example, marginalized people having better access and so on. And one of the ways that we fleshed out that black box was simply by referring to the literature on food security, which many people in fisheries have not really looked at. There's been a lot written about food security in fisheries by people who perhaps have not taken the time to read and understand the food security literature and to engage with people who work on this all the time. And when you look at where we fit in to food security, it's in the framework, it's there. Okay? So lack of access, lack of natural capital, that's declining fish stocks. Okay, it fits into the food security in that small place. So if we're to connect improved fisheries governance, leading to larger fish stocks, more cash from fishing, more nutritious fish, or whatever it is, we kind of have to pay some attention to how that fits into the rest of this. And the thing is that we can't actually change fishery management regimes without having some impact on these other factors that also impact food security. So understanding the knock-on effects of creating a marine protected area, of shifting a fishery management regime, and planning for that. Doesn't mean to say that you can't always, that you must never do this, because it's always going to affect someone negatively. It's just that understanding who it's going to affect negatively and how, and figuring out what you're going to do about that, is an important part of fishery management planning, and one that we often neglect. Okay, that's the fish. There are cases where marine protected areas lead to more accessible fish. This is about the only piece of direct evidence that I could find in a review of literature where people were actually eating more fish when they lived near a well-managed marine protected area. So high marine protected area effectiveness on the left, your left, and low marine protected area effectiveness on your right. And you can see that these are fish consumption figures by women and girls around protected areas in the Solomon Islands. And that's really the only piece of evidence we have for that whole discussion, that marine protected areas lead to improved food security. There's others which show a very mixed and ambiguous ones. There's some recent work in Kenya that shows that at least there's no negative impacts of marine protected areas on food security. And there's some studies which I've looked at closely in Tanzania, Mafia Island, an area near where I grew up, where there's actually evidence that suggests a negative impact of the creation of marine protected area in terms of child nutrition and so on. There's a problem with that study in that it lacks a control, and it lacks a before and after. So it's, it fits with a particular discourse. The evidence for it is not that strong. So that's direct access, but of course, there are ways that you can access food security that don't involve necessarily eating everything that you encounter. And when you look at studies of sort of large, charismatic marine fauna, like this one, a recent one in PLOS One, the value to fisheries of manta rays in Indonesia is less than $500,000, but the value to tourism is calculated as being $15 million. Okay, so obviously you'd want to keep these things alive. And the one problem with this, again, as an analysis, is that the analysis stops at that point. The link to food security is once again an empty black box. So if it were the same people who were getting that $500,000 who got the 15 million, of course everyone would do it. Everyone would be caressing manta rays. Nobody would think of killing them, but it's a very different group of people that will benefit. And that's the problem, the distribution, once again, of the benefits. And without analysing that, figuring out the incentive structures and the policy mechanisms that allow the increased value to be captured by those who need it and those who have lost access to the value that they were getting, we're not making the linkages between improved fisheries management and food security. We're also, of course, competing for space. We've got to find space for food production in increasingly crowded waters. The latest work I've been doing has been in the Niger Delta, incredibly productive biologically, covered in oil. We use an increasing amount of our coastal waters for oil and gas production, for energy production, rather than food production. If we were able to produce energy cleanly and safely, without spilling oil on things, we might also be able to produce food in the same places. But by and large, we can't. We've got all these competing uses. A recent paper by Peter Sale suggested some kind of global zoning of inshore waters. I buy it to some extent. I guess I had to. I was an author. But, reserves in coastal areas that are close to population centres actually have been sometimes as successful as those in remote locations. So the idea is that, that you can put your reserves in remote places and be more compromised about what you do in places near cities and markets is somewhat problematic, I think. The other thing we can do is we can separate fish production from the environment, overcome that space constraint by intensifying our aquaculture. And some of you may have read recently that intensively closed recirculating system salmon in the Midwest have been MSC aquaculture certified as sustainable. We can locate offshore as ways of overcoming that slowing growth of aquaculture and overcoming the problems of decreasing space for fish consumption in coastal areas. Or we can fiddle around with strategies for managing capture fisheries as well. Okay, here's a controversial one. Balanced harvest. So if you were thinking about managing fisheries for nutrition security, the greatest potential harvest, in theory, and this is just a model, is from unselected balanced harvesting, and that's the dotted black curve. Basically, selective harvesting are the solid curves, the kind of strategies we have now. Unselected harvesting, basically you take fish in each size class across the whole system in the proportion at which their production in the size class occurs. And you can take the most harvest, but you'll notice at the low fishing intensity. So if you aim for this kind of strategy, catching small fish as well as big fish, you have to be pretty confident that you can control fishing intensity. And I would perhaps solicit some opinions from you as to how confident you can be that you can do that. The other thing that we can do is sort of think about growing things lower in the food chain and eating things lower in the food chain. And again, this sort of points to the small fish one. Another perhaps controversial scientist, Jeppe Kolding, who I've known for a long time from a shared past in working in African lakes, sort of proposed this diagram, which I think has been modified from other sources, but basically points out that eating Nile perch, for example, is like eating the things that lion eaters would eat, trophically. And that humans are around about, globally, an average trophic level of about 2.1. And you know, the more sort of small fish that we eat, the more sense energetically that it makes. And therefore, you know, Jeppe is an advocate of balanced harvest and of eating small fish. And there's a nutritional case for eating more small fish. So the question is, how do we do this in a context of a failure to manage many fisheries? I'll skip through some work here on climate change, which basically concludes that in terms of overall global production, and our conclusions are very similar to some work done here by William Chung and colleagues, depending on how well the assumptions work in both their studies and ours, you could see a slight increase in global fish production under climate change, but a distributional shift. And together with innovations in aquaculture, we kind of concluded that if you managed fisheries well, and that's a big if, of course, and aquaculture proceeds more or less as it has been doing, then there should be enough fish to maintain current global levels of consumption in 2050. And projections to a shorter period, 2030, from World Bank modeling also suggests that, okay, there's not going to be more capture fisheries, that's pretty much leveled off. Aquaculture will continue to grow, and therefore global supply will also continue to grow. We've also done sort of work at smaller levels on how do you capture this increased production and this value and divert it in ways that are needed. And this was a study that Johan Bell led, which I was also part of in the Pacific, looking at how you could sustain the fish consumption demands and perhaps increase fish consumption in the small island states of the Pacific, which are facing a lot of health issues at the moment, trying to restore more traditional diets as part of public health. How do you do that when inshore fisheries that people are currently accessing are overexploited and tuna are all exported? And the study basically said that if you could divert a really quite small proportion of tuna into domestic consumption, that you could solve the anticipated increased needs of the region for fish, both in terms of meeting health needs and the growing population in the region. So the difficult thing for me at this point, and the sort of less satisfactory part of this paper, was, well, how do you do that? Asking people to asking governments to reduce their revenue, even if it's only by 6%, and asking firms to sort of divert some of their catch at decreased profit into local markets is not something that you can do under sort of free market conditions. You need some directive policy instrument that allows you to do that. We're also concerned about the ways that we produce and distribute fish globally, the justice of doing that, of making fish accessible by it being cheaper, the costs, the human costs of doing that. And so I want to finish then with really a brief sketch of what governing fisheries for food and nutrition as a central concept, rather than value, economic value or MSY or anything else, might look like. Well, we catch and eat more small, nutrient-dense fish. We conserve more big fish because they're worth more dead than alive. We'd orientate aquaculture to produce nutrient-rich fish and shellfish at low trophic levels. We'd support the access regimes and value chains of inland and coastal small-scale fishing that supply fish to the kinds of consumers that need them, and not continue to support our current policy emphasis, which seems to be about getting more of the world's fish onto the plates of people who are rich and already overfed. Okay, so a vision then of making fish available to those who need it for a healthy life, and producing and distributing fish in ways that respect environmental limits, economic needs, social aspirations, and cultural values. That would be my policy vision for the future of fisheries. I think we tend not to have policy visions. We have management targets and objectives. So I'd be interested to know what your policy visions are for the future of fisheries. Thanks very much.
Do we have a student for our first question? Go for it, Simon.
I just had one brief question about the idea of targeting species lower on the trophic pyramid. And I was wondering how that would mesh with the idea of ecosystem-based management, and the fact that a lot of these forage fish are central to many of the pelagic ecosystems and support many predators which are themselves fish in many cases. And I'm wondering how that would mesh with your vision that you articulated.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, just targeting and pulling out all the forage fish would be a terribly bad idea. And I think the balanced harvest advocates say that, well, if you look at the relationship between the size of fish and the total production, that you can take a proportion of fish from all the harvest classes. So if most of your production is in small fish, then the proportion of small fish in your catch will be higher if you adopt a sort of balanced harvest strategy. That you will only be taking out sort of surplus production, and you're also taking out a proportion of the big things that eat those small things. So the overall structure of the ecosystem shouldn't change. Now, I don't know how you're going to do this in practice. I'd be interested to know anybody who's thought about that, and whether anybody thinks it's at all possible.
Given how little we know about many of these ecosystems, it might be very difficult to implement in practice.
Another question?
Thanks.
Anybody?
Do you have any thoughts about sort of the structures for managing fisheries in terms of what might work best, either commonly managed or top-down? What sort of systems might be more effective for keeping these fishes?
I think the easy answer is it depends where. But I think in general, where it depends on how people organize property rights and see economic activity. Anthropologists have come up with a sort of spectrum of collaborative activity across different cultures and different societies. Kind of modern North America is at one end of that spectrum in terms of a highly individualized model of society, that we're autonomous individuals, and that we don't engage in much collective behavior, and not much collective economic behavior particularly. And there are other societies that are at the other end of the spectrum. So, there are places that I work that have seen the rationale of individual transferable quotas and various other market instruments, fisheries governance, and they look at them and they just don't see the logic. It just doesn't fit with their cultural model of how things work. And so they reject them. So it's immensely frustrating to these highly rational economists that their evidently superior model for managing fisheries is just rejected by a bunch of people on sort of vague, we just don't like that sort of stuff. But people react quite viscerally to the language and the ethos of some of this without necessarily engaging in the kinds of analysis that would please the people who are advocating it. And I think you have to recognize that. You can't always manage fisheries in the same way. So in a place where communitarian models work, use communitarian ones. They're already there, usually. I mean, sometimes they've been forgotten or suppressed or ignored, but there's often some basis for them. And they'll have to respond to changing circumstances. Traditional models not always adequate in modern societies.
I think it was Daniel first and then Rebecca.
Well, two little things. I like very much what you have said about all developing countries. One sees the experience that you have acquired there. I can say that in a Sea Rounders project, we have checked the trajectory of aquaculture. We have reproduced from the bottom up the statistics of FAO, and we were able to. We have exactly the same trajectory, not exactly the same projections for the future, but the same trajectory. This is very different for capture fisheries. And in fact, we are going to, in a few months, in a few weeks, I will present here, I think, a summary of all of this. But this is a project over 12 years. Essentially, the catch of the world is much higher because of this IUU component that you present, including Typanotonus for West Africa.
All right.
And the trajectory is very different, is much higher, the catch. And it is declining very fast. And the projection that the World Bank and the FAO have are ridiculous. Because essentially what they think is an equilibrium situation, which would mean every stock is maintained, is actually a succession of depletion that are happening geographically at different places. And this business goes as long as you can maintain, as you can access new areas. And the reason why there is a gradual decline that is even visible in the FAO data is because there are no new areas to access. So the idea that you find in Sofia of a stable world catch is a complete fiction and is absurd. Yes, it is stable in the sense that water flow is stable, but this is not something that can be maintained for a long time because it depends on expansion. And the result, this or more or less stability is maintained only by a few countries in the Eastern Indian Ocean and Western Pacific. If you isolate these countries, the world catch is going down, and our reconstruction also show that very rapidly. And this projection are complete nonsense, therefore. And that will obviously change a lot. You wanted feedback?
Yeah.
There it is. That will change. That will massively change the projection that you can do for the future.
Great, thanks. Sounds like I need to come and listen to this release of new data.
I'm sorry, we are running out of time. There's a class coming in. Sorry, we're going to have to. But we move it outside, and Eddie will be here all day long. So find him and approach him if you have any questions. And thank